In our high stakes business environment, a silent epidemic is sweeping through our workplaces. It goes largely unnoticed until a major crisis erupts. Across all sectors, leaders are pushing themselves and their teams to the absolute brink. It results in a pervasive wave of isolation, high stress, and with burnout. This not only cripples productivity, it it stifles innovation and it leads to devastating turnover rates, a lack of employee satisfaction, and it affects every level of the organization. So, what's behind all this? Well, that's what we're talking about today on Marc Haine Live. Welcome to this episode. This is where small business owners and entrepreneurs pick up core skill sets to help them create the show stopping, jaw dropping experiences that their customers and their employees deserve. I am your host, Customer and Employee Experience Strategist Marc Haine, and today my guest is the Adversity Transformation Coach, Jay Lambert. Today we will be diving into the pervasive issue of burnout among leaders and their teams. We're going to be exploring the deep rooted causes and the wide reaching impacts of productivity on organizational health and team health. We'll also uncover how to find a more compassionate, holistic approach to leadership that can transform this crisis into an opportunity for growth and for resilience. So stick with us. And as I always say, if you know somebody who could use this information, you know somebody who's kind of working in a high stressed environment needs this content, please feel free to share a link to this episode because knowledge is power, but only if we share it. I have to tell you, my daughter used to work for a trailer rental and repair agency. And after many months of high stress interactions, her boss had to take stress leave. Now, in the absence of the general manager, the responsibilities fell on all the other staff. The stress that the manager was feeling was now pushed down to all levels of staff, including her. She was actually, as the assistant manager, she was given all the duties that had to be performed without having the proper training, without having any kind of coaching. And this stress was felt at every level of the organization. Today, 3 months later, they are still struggling. They have had to kind of meter what work they can do now. They're no longer contracting to do trailer repairs for other companies. They're only concentrating on only their stock. Their productivity has dropped so much so that their competitors, are now going to other places. This is a perfect case study of the unrecognized epidemic of stress and burnout that is pervasive in today's workplace. So I can't help but ask the question of the day. So, have you ever stopped to consider how the stress and fatigue that you're feeling might be echoing across your team or organization? Could this be the root cause of deeper issues that may be impacting your operations success and maybe even the financial stability? I'd love for you to be part of this conversation. Why don't you go ahead, share this episode on your favorite social media platform, hashtag it experienced leadership, put your comments down, and this is a perfect way for you to have a voice on what your experiences have been like and what maybe even some of the steps that you're taking to be able to counter some of the issues caused by high stress burnouts. As I mentioned, my guest today is the Adversity Transformation Coach, Jay Lambert. Jay has dedicated over 2 decades to pioneering transformative projects within the healthcare organizations within that industry. He's got deep-rooted backgrounds in the Métis Cree and French Canadian heritage, and Jay brings a unique, holistic approach to coaching, merging the best of Indigenous and Western perspectives. He holds a Master of Science in Health Information Science and is an ICF Associate Certified Coach. He is known for his compassionate leadership and trauma informed approach that he takes as he transforms people's lives and the lives of people's teams. He guides them through how to turn their challenges into their greatest strengths. Jay, it is such an honor to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Maybe you could start off by telling me a little bit about how you serve your clients.
Sure. Offer a few different services. So one-on-one coaching is how I started as part of my work. And in those cases, I'm usually working about 6 sessions or so one-on-one, where I really let the clients determine what they want, what they need, and support them just by holding space for them and asking them questions to really help them build awareness, and through that awareness, moving to action.
And so, do I get a sense you also work with teams?
And yes, I do work with teams.
Okay.
It's a relatively new area I've been moving into.
Okay.
So I've started working with my first team, and I am working towards my advanced credential from the ICF in team coaching.
Love it.
Really driven by seeing the impact on individuals, but then recognizing that they're still often in a team environment that is maybe not as supportive or collaborative as it could be, and so seeing a real potential for further transformation working with collectives.
I love it. It's so needed now, and but I think that today though, stress and burnout is so pervasive. Yet I don't see that people actually can recognize it. They just figure this is just typically this is just what happens. Can you describe the typical signs of burnout that you've observed in either individuals or organizations?
Yeah, it's very typical. In fact, a lot of people that burn out are often the A plus players, the driven ones, who have had abundances of energy and capacity. Uh, they just don't see it happening to themselves. Is often what happens, and then just suddenly, all of a sudden, they find themselves not functioning. Is usually what happens. It kind of builds and builds and builds, and then something snaps, and then next thing you know, they're taking time off from work. Sometimes they're in the hospital. Um, but the early warning signs usually are uh, irritability, and lack of capacity to manage emotions as well as previously had. Fatigue is a big one. For me personally, it was a loss of capacity intellectually. Uh,
Mm.
a lot of my early work I started off in policy analysis and such, so reading and comprehension were a big thing, and I found myself slowly, or I didn't notice, but it's like it was getting harder and harder to read. It was getting harder and harder to comprehend. And at my worst, it was like reading a paragraph was like reading hieroglyphics. It was
Mm.
just, it got that bad for me. But yeah, it impacts kind of all aspects. But fatigue and irritability, I think, are two of the early canaries in the coal mine.
So what do you think are the core factors that contribute to high levels of burnout among managers and their teams? What do you think are some of the core challenges?
Workload, particularly coming from a healthcare perspective, workload number one. It's we have especially coming, well, even before COVID, but especially through what we experienced with COVID. We've extra numbers of people being sick, and just there's more work than we have people to do it. And I think that's probably the case in a lot of other fields as well. And then capacity to manage the stress that comes with that are would be the two that I would say are the biggest ones.
It's interesting because I just came back from doing a presentation to the Alberta government through their frontline staff who are responsible for handling all the telephone calls in in transactions where there's high stress, high emotions, and that sort of thing. And so it was my presentation was all about dealing with difficult people, but at the same token, not only serving the customer but serving yourself and finding ways to do that. When we're not able to manage the consequences of the high stress and burnout. What are the consequences if we just leave all this unchecked?
The consequences are, as you said in your opening, is high turnover. People leave. I think it's getting to be a crisis in the Canadian healthcare system, particularly with nurses leaving the field entirely. So not just taking a leave of absence to rest and recover, but actually leaving entirely. Um, that there's a cost in like trying to refill the roles, the onboarding costs, all of those things. But even if they don't actually leave, they're not functioning at the level that they should be, um, on many levels. So as I shared, like from a cognitive capacity, are they making the best decision? Again, I'll stick with the healthcare examples, but are they making the best decision? That's usually when mistakes happen with medications and stuff. Is people are missing things, or and continuing to work without being able to fully take in everything and process everything appropriately, and that can have dire consequences. But then there's the fatigue. There's and well, and again, and I would say again, not just healthcare, but irritability is a negative impact on your patients that you're working with. And if you're in business, that's a negative impact on your potential customers. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
if you're irritable, well, and then it extends to your family, it extends to your friends, and then it can spiral from there.
And you've got then a nice little percolation of a toxic workplace because it will the irritability, the not being able to focus on what you're doing, your job performance, and so on is going to spread towards everybody else. And it's interesting that we see, uh, and I'm using my daughter as an example, the level of stress that was created because the manager went on stress leave, and then the director left, and all of a sudden all these things came percolating to the surface, all these things about what's wrong with the business, and everybody became severely dissatisfied because everything. I think it's funny. I reflect on that and I think about Stephen Covey's The Trust Bank Account, right? And it's just like in an instant, as these people left, the trust in the organization as a whole just kept on dropping and dropping and dropping to the point where they were severely withdrawn. And people are like, I don't have to take it here. I don't have to do this work here. There are plenty of people who will hire me for my skills today.
Exactly. Yeah, I've yet to read that book, but I'm very aware of it, and I have read some summaries on it, and that yeah, the speed of trust is an essential piece, and an essential piece of resilience and compassion is relationships.
Hmm. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into why these things are happening, and maybe even some actionable strategies to that we could use to better manage burnout. And we'll get to that right after this.
When the spotlight shines on your business, are customers applauding or yawning? In other words, how is your business performing? Make your business a star with the new book, Lights, Camera, Action, Business Operational Excellence Through the Lens of Live Theater by Marc Haine. Marc uses his business and acting experience to help you see your business like a live show, so you can create a performance your customers will never forget. Buy Lights, Camera, Action today at your favorite online retailer or directly at marchaine.com.
Welcome back. I am speaking with the adversity transformation coach, Jay Lambert. I guess before we can talk about steps to manage stress and burnout, we have to learn how to recognize it. Now, can you can you tell us a little bit about how do we shift our mindset from this is just a stressful job, it's normal, everybody who's in this industry is stressed out just because that's the way it is, versus this is a work environment. We need to instigate change. There are solutions to it. How do we figure that out?
think the first step is with anything is awareness. So awareness of self is probably number one. Because if you want to, I like the saying, if you want to see the change, be the change.
Hmm.
Uh, and so being it just kind of more generalizing, really being clear on what your values are, what your strengths, your weaknesses are, um, and then working from there. So if your strengths, like, so for example, I did a lot of work in project management, did some assessments. I scored really low on detail, and realizing is like, okay, and it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, because I don't thrive in that area. I can do it perfectly well, but it's not my strength, and so it takes up more of my energy. And so maybe I need to be looking at something that plays more to my strengths, and work in that area, because I'm all for working on your weaknesses, but that does take up more energy. And in a workplace environment, it's often actually it's beneficial to be playing to your strengths, and then hopefully finding a teammate that can shore up those areas that are your weaknesses.
Hmm. I know that in past episodes, by the way, this is episode 200. I don't know if we've mentioned that, but this is episode 200. So this is like a real hallmark for us, a real milestone. But in our previous episode, probably somewhere around the 100th mark, I had an expert come in talking about exhaustion and the way our bodies kind of manipulate and kind of manifest and use sleep to recharge ourselves, and how some people are really good first thing during the day, other people are really good after lunch. Should this be some semblance of awareness that we need to adapt as leaders? We might have people who are better not only at the detail stuff or the planning stuff, or the stuff that really can move the business forward, but should we be concerned about where people are kind of psychologically and through the physicality of their presence?
I would say 100% yes. So I wasn't really sure if I was a morning person or an evening person. A lot of my, yeah, especially my early 20s and such, were spent in the food and beverage industry. So you work till 2 a.m. and such. But I've over the years really realized I'm actually a morning person, and my brain kind of shuts down at about 3 p.m.
Hmm.
Uh, so I get the bulk of my work done. So I've been fortunate. The employers I have had have been flexible with that. I'll start at 7:30, and then wrap up 3:30. So I get my hours in, and they're my more productive hours. Um, the if I was forced to, say, work the 9 to 5, which goes a couple hours over, you'd probably be losing a fair amount of productivity with me, in that my brain, I'd be sitting in front of my computer, maybe moving stuff, moving the mouse around, but what
Hmm.
would I actually be accomplishing would be another a good question.
Yeah. And so to understand that in the confines of being a leader, being able to understand that you do have different people with different needs, again, I've been heavily kind of falling onto the idea that today managers need to be more like coaches than managers. We need to understand the individuals on our team rather than treating everybody like one size fits all.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I had one particular. I'm an ambivert. I probably leaning towards an extrovert, but I had an extreme introvert on my team, in a previous team, and that made for a lot of learning for me, because it was completely foreign to me. But at the same time, they were spectacular at their work, and so it was really I felt it was my responsibility to figure out how best to support them. Took a while, but I'm very proud of the work we managed to accomplish together.
Yeah. You mentioned in your notes that you sent me this idea about two eye seeing. Obviously, before we can solve the problem, we need to see the problem. Could you define what two eye seeing is?
So yeah, it's a term that's used more commonly in First Nations, Indigenous realms, where uh, we hold on to our traditional ancestral wisdom, as well as incorporating the Western scientific notions, the best practices, what have you. Really, kind of looking at it from that holistic perspective. not dismissing one or the other as better, but really trying to make the best of both worlds, use the best of both tools.
And so, do you see when you kind of put that lens on, do you see that there are conflicts between kind of the indigenous lens that you're talking about, that it seems to be a lot more holistic and a lot more grounded, I think, in nature and spirituality, based on, and then have that going against kind of business practices and how to make a profit and how to minimize expenses.
For sure. I honestly don't believe it should be, but I see it all the time. And if we kind of look from a purely scientific, like a very scientific lens, like the gold standard is the, I don't know, RCTs, randomized control trials. Sorry, it took me a second to process that. But again, it's very focused, very specific, and it is actually quite a valuable approach. However, it does ignore a lot of potentially confounding factors. So to really get the value out of an RCT is okay, you get that piece of information, but then what's the question that comes up from that we now need to go test with another RCT, then another test, and then kind of continuing to get that broader picture. However, in the Western sciences, often I've seen anyways, is we find the answer maybe we like or that resonates, and then we just kind of sit with that. We don't actually go, okay, well, what are the things that we haven't considered here, and that are part of that bigger picture. And so that's where I would say the Indigenous holistic, everything's connected lens. So as a person, um, like it kind of actually bugs me that the World Health Organization, their definition of burnout is specific to work. I
Mm.
know for a fact my burnout was very much also impacted by what was going on at home. There was a lot of stuff going on at home that was on top of that. So for me, it was a bigger picture than just what was happening at work.
So what you're telling me is that, as much as the businesses want you to leave your personal problems at the door, as human beings, maybe we're not capable of doing that to any great degree.
I would yes, and there's some aspect I do agree with that. It's like, okay, well, don't just start bringing all your problems to work,
Yeah.
but at the same time, as a manager, I need to acknowledge that you're a whole person and you have a life outside of work, and that life, um, if you're going through a divorce or there's a sick child at home or something, those things are going to impact the work. And as a manager, I can either support that, I can either find a way to support you in however I'm able to, or I can try to crack the whip harder and see how that works. And I
Yeah.
don't think my experience is it doesn't, it usually doesn't.
Exactly. So aside from putting kind of looking at this holistic side and to kind of tame it into our business environments, uh, to me, that's like putting a different lens on it. Like just like with my book, I wrote, what happens if we put a lens of live theater onto our business? How would we do things differently? If we take this kind of more grounded, holistic, earthier kind of natural lens to put it onto our businesses, what kind of innovation do you think that would create for organizations?
Innovation, I think it would really support, again, just looking at the problem differently, as you just said. Um, especially if you've been in the same job or you've been doing things in a way, there's a reason why people say, well, we've been doing it this way and it works. Well, is it really working? Like, or is the information that you're collecting actually supporting, like, is it a lot of the work I've seen reporting, it reports on activities, not outcomes. So yes, you made so many phone sales calls, but how many? So it's that one's pretty easy. It's like, okay, but in things like healthcare, yes, you treated so many patients, but are they improving? What's their outcomes, their health outcomes further down the line? And how, from a healthcare perspective, just imagine the shift if we moved from, and there's people like Dr. Peter Attia, who are trying to push this shift, but what would happen if our healthcare system wasn't based on just treating sickness, but actually moving upstream and keeping people well? so that they're not coming into the healthcare system. That would be transformational. And there's attempts, but it's a really big beast that is challenging to move. And a lot of it is because there are a number of people that just aren't ready, willing to really see that shift, or even accept that there's a whole lot of people that need to be involved in the shift.
Yes. And, using now putting that lens onto the businesses, that can be said for all the different crises that we face each and every day. It can be we could apply that lens to labor turnovers, to a level, the high level of disengagement in organizations, to the toxicity within workplaces, and so on. Instead of kind of identifying each individual crisis and saying, okay, let's put a band-aid on this. Can we do something that's going to create a more holistic view, a holistic approach to our culture, so we solve the culture problem first before we start playing with all the symptoms? Is that fair?
Oh yes, I think that's a lot of as a team coach. That's really what I'm trying to get at the heart of. I might not be necessarily using those terms.
Yeah.
How are we working together? How, as we mentioned earlier, how are we ensuring that we're building and maintaining trust, and setting that really strong foundation? So to bring in the Indigenous perspective, community was number one. That was how you survived. Was your role in was being a part of a community, and you had a role from childhood that included responsibilities, and so you were learning from the aunties and the uncles, and you were working and you were participating, and everybody had roles and responsibilities, and it was that cohesiveness and collectiveness that really helped communities survive millennia in North America, since time immemorial, is what
Mhm.
is usually said.
It's interesting that you said that, because as you were saying that, I got goosebumps, because I had just mentioned to somebody on their podcast that we have to stop thinking about our businesses and our teams like we're a family. I mean, that is probably the number one thing I hear from people. Oh, things are great. We're just like a family here. And it's like, but you're not. You're not a family. But what you are is a community. And so when you said this about the community, the goosebumps just started coming up. It's like, yes, we're on to something. If we could stop thinking about our teams and our companies and so on as family, because I mean, let's face it, you're never going to fire your mom from being your mom, or your father from being your father, or your sister from being a sister. Okay, maybe you would, but really we wouldn't. So if we change that lens about this idea of, we're all family, to we are all part of a community, doesn't that just shift the whole mindset?
I would hope so.
Yeah.
And again, it's a not again going back is it was a survival mechanism, but it was also a way of thriving.
Hmm. Yes. So if this is resonating for the audience, how could they get a hold of you if they want to connect with you, and if they want to pick your brain and figure out how you can help them?
Sure. Well, I have a website.
Hmm.
It's fairly simple. It's my name, jaylambert.ca. And so it's easy to find there. I'm also most active on LinkedIn. So you
Okay.
can find me there, Jay Lambert. Well, I can't remember my LinkedIn URL offhand, but if you search up Jay
It's in
Lambert,
the
you
show
should.
notes.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, we put it
um,
in the show notes.
Less so, but I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and occasionally TikTok. But I've been mostly active on LinkedIn.
Okay. So aside from the different lens that we just talked about, are there any other strategies or guidance principles that you would suggest if leaders wanted to get started with this?
Strategies like for building resilience,
Yeah, for
compassion.
recognizing and building resilience and overcoming burnout.
Well, again, first thing, notice, become aware, what's going on for yourself, what's actually going on. I'm a big fan of 360s in the workplace. They can be pretty pricey, but you can do them. I created one for myself, and I did it on Google Forms. I got about 30 different in my previous work. Got about 30 responses, and it was in some ways was very eye-opening, because areas that I thought I was actually pretty strong in, other people didn't agree with me.
Hmm.
and 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 that's important feedback. So even if I'm making an effort and attempting, somebody's interpreting the way I'm doing things in the opposite of what I actually am. And so that's data that I can now use to explore further, get curious, what's going on there. I did it anonymously, so I wasn't able to like chase down the person and do that, but I was able to accept and acknowledge that, okay, not everybody sees me the way I feel I'm presenting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so these are areas for growth. And so that's number one. And then extending that to your team, and the teams that you're working with. So building the relationships professionally is in a community way, so that there's the trust, there's the collaboration, and then hopefully then that culture is expanding into the other teams, because most teams don't operate in a vacuum. They have to work with other teams, and so again, building the relationships with those other teams. um, I've had a background where I've been the bull in the china shop, and I've gone after the other teams for the ridiculousness that they were doing and stuff, and um, rarely successful. Uh, when I would approach it as, okay, I'm gonna build a relationship here and see how we can work together. And because they have their mandates, they have their requirements, I have my mandates and my requirements, but yet we still have to work together. When I approach it as a relationship, it's amazing what we can get done all of a sudden. Whereas if you just kind of go after somebody, uh, they put up their dukes and it's a fight.
Yes. You mentioned this thing about recognizing and watching and being present in the workplace. Are there signs that, like, are there any early warning signs before people become aggressive, before people start quitting and become super disengaged? Are there any other signs that maybe leaders should be watching out for, that we might be leaning towards a more high stress, burnout laden culture?
um, I think willingness to engage. So if so I said irritability, but even before that, some people will get more irritable. Some people will shut down. Um, and Noticing, like, if you actually spend the time to get to know your team and your peers and your colleagues, uh, hopefully you'll notice a shift in their demeanor, their attitude. I still remember quite vividly. Uh, it was after the fact, but I been in a fairly stressful, somewhat toxic environment, and had a really strong group of colleagues and friends that we were supporting each other. And then I can't remember exactly, but somewhere in there, I was diagnosed with depression. And as soon as I shared that, it was like, oh, okay, I thought you were different. But they didn't, because it was like, you're not who, because they knew something had changed, something had shifted. They
Yeah.
couldn't put a finger on exactly when it was. But there was a shift in me, and there was a shift in how I showed up at work. And they noticed it. Uh, I, for whatever reason, either didn't feel comfortable or wasn't sure, didn't trust that they noticed it. So I'm not holding them accountable for any of that, but but they did notice is more my point. And so if you're paying attention, getting curious, you notice something, ask what's going, like, I've seen a shift. Is everything okay? I think
Hmm.
and that's part of that compassionate leadership approach, is checking in with your team when you do see a shift, that's something's not going right, or everything seems right but their performance is like, oh, it's like, okay, this is not your best work, like, what's going on.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into the role that the team can play in defining the kind of culture that we want in order to overcome this idea of high stress and burnout. And we'll get to that right after this.
When you're delivering an important speech to a huge audience, it's easy to lose your place or go way over time. Give yourself an advantage with the Pro Speaker Presentation Speech Timer app. No more checking your watch or calling for time. The Pro Speaker Presentation Speech Timer app keeps you on track with easy-to-see timers, even changing color for visual prompts during your speech. And you can set audio cues to practice, or set it to vibrate so you don't even have to look. Be the pro you know you are. Download the app at speakerpresentationtimer.com.
As you can probably figure out, Jay and I are passionate about serving business owners and your teams uh, wholeheartedly. Like our whole means to be on this planet is to help you. So if you are planning a management retreat, if you're planning a convention or a conference, and you would like some help, you'd like to explore maybe how we can work with you, please check and connect with us. Our contact details are in the show notes. We'd be more than happy to help with whatever you need. Jay, how important is it to co-create solutions? Once you realize what the problem is, how important is it to co-create the solutions with one's teams? And what would that look like?
Uh, I can't even put a number on. It's like it's 100% co-creation. I just nobody likes being done to.
Yes.
That's my experience. And we also don't, as leaders, managers, as a coach, I don't know the intimate details of absolutely everything about your personality, your skills, and everything, and what challenges you have. So really getting into that space of co-creating, sharing my knowledge and skills, and coming from a coaching perspective, really diving in and pulling out the feedback is how you're going to get the best solution. And I've seen that a lot where we don't co-create things. We try to create solutions for somebody, and they never work because there's always something that we missed. Like there's something about their environment, there's something about their personality that we just kind of glaze over. And I'm speaking very specifically about individuals at the moment, but again, even as teams, it's like, do we understand the strengths of our teams? Is there something missing? And especially as our teams grow and our organizations grow, it gets harder and harder to see all those aspects. So the need to really rely on our on the ground folks, the folks that are in the different areas, whether it be finance, marketing, and our and for healthcare, it's pharmacists and nurses and surgeons. Like everybody has to work together and has a perspective that the others don't, but could be absolutely critical if you miss.
Yes, I see both sides, right? I see that we are in organizations right now where we are top down. And so the boss is up there saying, okay, we're going to fix this. And they get together with all the executive managers and say, what incentive program can we do? Or what reward system can we do to change all this? And it's all based on assumptions. It's based on assumptions like the young generation don't want to work. The older generations are getting fed up with the younger generation. And there's so many different assumptions that we're using, but it's not until we actually sit down with people and actually talk to people can we make those changes.
Well, and you said, you jumped on assumptions, and yeah, that's the saying, "Make an ass of you and me." When we but one of the best lessons I had from a mentor in project management is like in project management, you're supposed to list out your assumptions in your project charter, and I was taught, well, you take it a step further. It's like you list those assumptions and then you fact check them.
Yes.
And when you move forward on that project, they are no longer assumptions. They are like, do you know these for a fact?
Yes.
It's like, do we have the budget? Do we have this or that or the other? Is a pretty key piece that and I've seen projects fail on it because an assumption was made. We made that assumption, but we didn't check it, and then we get along, and all of a sudden, oh, that was a pretty important piece that's not actually there.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I can see that all the time. In fact, even as entrepreneurs, we make assumptions all the time by, what is it that we think our customers are dealing with and what problems do they want solved and all that. But it's not until we actually talk to them that we actually figure it out.
And to go back to something, because often what drives these top-down decisions is cost.
Yes.
It's the cost to do that engagement, the cost to spend the time figuring things out. But my question always back is what's the cost if this
You
failed
don't.
because you
Yeah.
didn't do your due diligence? And it's amazing how many people will still push back and go ahead anyways, but almost guaranteed the results are not there because again of the missed assumptions, the lack of engagement. So there's resistance all over the place, and on and on and on.
And there's plenty of proof that as human beings, we get tied down to our belief systems and what we think is a good idea, and we will hang our hat on these things, and we will take it up the hill to make sure we wage war behind it. And when somebody tries to show us that, oh, maybe we might be mistaken, or there might be some correction needed, a lot of people will hang really, really tough. It takes a lot of humility to turn around and say, okay, maybe I don't have all the answers.
And I think that's a sign of a really good leader is being able to take the risk
Uh-huh.
of making maybe a courage of maybe taking a difficult decision, but then also accepting ownership of that. And leaders who can do that are seem to be few and far between, but the people that they have working with them are just 100% behind them.
And we're not talking about taking ownership when things go well. We're talking also about taking ownership when things go horribly, horribly wrong.
Absolutely, yes. Even more so, actually, when things go well, a good leader is actually making sure that they're
Celebrating
passing on
the team.
praise
Yeah.
to their teams. Yeah.
Yeah. For anybody who's tuning into this who says, yeah, I think we need to do some work. We need to identify the high stress areas, the areas where burnout seems to be more prevalent. Um, we have to fix this. Are there any cautionaries or pitfalls that we should be addressing or being aware of before we do any kind of change?
Uh, the first is, well, again, we talked about it a bit, but yeah, is just checking with yourself first. Where are you at? What's going on with you? Um, with burnout, making sure that you're not trying to do it all alone. Uh, Making sure that you've got not just your team support, but your family support, professional support. Can't highlight that enough. So counseling, my case, psychiatrists, doctors. I've been fortunate. I've actually come off my medications for depression and anxiety over the last 6 months, and that's been a process. But I've done it in a way with clinical supervision that I'm feeling very confident that I will not have to go back there. Whereas if you just kind of dump off, then you could be setting yourself up on a yo-yo. Um, yeah.
And so, any other cautionaries about, because essentially what we are talking about is we're talking about shifting our corporate cultures, right?
Yeah, I think the cautionary is oh, my brain's just not thinking that you recognizing that you don't always have all the answers
Right.
again. So kind of that
Having that
self-awareness,
humility piece.
the humility piece, having compassion, like making sure you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
Like so, my previous employer, the First Nations Health Authority, I really like. They have a like a mantra mandate. It's like it starts with me. So everything that we're doing is if I want to be affecting all these changes in all these areas, but that starts with me. Um, Pitfalls are it's all somebody else's it's all somebody else. I can't do this until this situation uh, gets dealt with. Um, so like for example, like even the fact that it is stressful, there's certain environments that are always stressful. And so shifting your mindset is like, okay, is this stress negative or is this stress positive? Can I make this a positive stress?
Mhm.
Um, if you're an athlete, it's all about balancing that stress for growth and performance. the stress is actually a positive. And there's research. There's I know Andrew Huberman, a famous podcaster right now. He did an episode on that, and again, proof that shifting your mindset even just around stress. So we do talk, like, obviously there's managing stress, and okay, let's breathe and journal and all those things, but then not just trying to avoid negative stress, but actually reviewing the stress and going, okay, how can I look at this as a positive? How can I see this as moving out of my comfort zone into a learning and growth zone that is actually going to make things better for me in possibly the short term, definitely the long term.
Right.
Uh,
This has been brilliant. Could you remind everybody, Jay, how they can get a hold of you one more time?
Sure. I have a website, jaylambert.ca, all one word, and then I'm also on LinkedIn. And you can, from both of those locations, you can book a 50-minute discovery call with me for either for yourself as a leader, if you're interested in having me work with you and your team. And I'm in the process also of doing some group coaching programs. So group coaching, not necessarily for teams, but people who have similar backgrounds and such, specifically around avoiding or getting away from burnout, avoiding burnout, and making adversity your superpower. So that's one of the cool things about going through a lot of crap is you learn a lot, and then you also have that experience, and you become an expert in the field because you've been through it, and so take advantage of those adversities is something that I'm really pushing for.
Love that. I am a big fan that we are the sum of our experiences, and who we are today could not have happened without everything that came before. Jay, as we wrap up, do you have any last thoughts? Anything that we haven't talked about that you think is important to mention?
Just the importance of wellness, I think, is I just want to reiterate that. If you're not well, you can't take, and I mean that from a mental perspective, a physical perspective, an emotional perspective. But if you can't do that, if you're not well, it's that much harder. Maybe you are helping others, and in your work and at home, but it's that much harder to do it. When you're well, it's a huge shift. For me, I went from completely burnt out, adrenal fatigue, sleeping all the time, very irritable, brain not functioning. Um, and fortunately, I've been fortunate to work with a coach myself who helped me get through that. Uh, my energy's way up. But probably the most impactful thing is my family tells me they like me better.
That's always the positive. It's always the positive. Jay, thank you again. I really appreciate you being here to share your knowledge, your passion, and of course, your expertise. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
If you have any questions about today's episode, or you would like a complimentary 30-minute brainstorming session with you and your team, feel free to book yourself on my online calendar. The link is down below. It's the one that's marked meetwith.markhaine.com. As always, I am at your service. And if you haven't done so yet, why don't you make sure you subscribe to this feed and follow me on social media? I post a lot of great information. Sometimes it's my own stuff, but sometimes I am pulling from these podcasts into some really great learning outcomes. So I hope you can celebrate those learning outcomes for yourself. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Marc Haine. I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope you dare to be the exception.